Welcome to the Informal Purchase Methods for Community Nutrition Programs. This webinar is for agencies participating in the Child and Adult Care Food Program, which we will refer to as the CACFP, and the Summer Food Service Program, which we will refer to as the SFSP. I'm Lori Pennings. Presenting with me today is Courtney Hardoin. We developed this webinar because training agencies on the procurement regulations is a top priority of the Nutrition Services Division, or NSD. In order to be successful, all agencies must ensure they understand and are compliant with the different procurement methods.
The purpose of this webinar is to describe the requirements of the two informal purchase methods and determine when to use these methods.
In December 2014, the federal government issued Title II Code of Federal Regulations, Part 200, Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards. The NSD refers to this document as the Uniform Grant Guidance because it consolidates 8 older regulatory sections into one document that covers all administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for all federal awards. The guidance in these regulations pertain to all agencies that receive federal awards or funds, not just agencies participating in the child care or summer programs. The procurement standards are covered in sections 200.318 to 200.326. Before we discuss the different informal purchase methods, it's important to point out that in the federal regulations, 2 CFR Part 200.318D, it includes the requirement that agencies make an appropriate analysis to determine the most economical approach. This means agencies should consider all purchase methods, even if they are not required based upon the purchase threshold. Let's look at the definition in the Merriam-Webster Dictionary for the term economical. It states that economical means marked by careful, efficient, and prudent use of resources, operating with little waste, or at a savings, for example, having an economical car. The point to remember is even though a procurement method such as the micropurchase method may be allowable based on the dollar amount of the single purchase transaction, agencies should always consider whether using that method is the most economical approach. We will return to this concept later in the webinar. Courtney, what are the two types of informal purchase methods?
The two types of informal purchase methods are micropurchases and small purchases. Let's get started with Part 1, the micropurchase method.
Courtney, what is a micropurchase?
Lori, agencies may not be familiar with this term because it's new to federal regulations. It pertains to single purchase transactions equal to or below the micropurchase threshold, which is currently set at $3,500. Agencies should be aware that this dollar amount changes from time to time. It is determined by the Federal Acquisition Regulation, Part 2, Section 101. Agencies should also keep in mind that the micropurchase threshold may be even lower than the federal threshold of $3,500, depending on local rules or laws.
Courtney, you stated a micropurchase is a single purchase transaction that is equal to or below $3,500. Can you give me some examples of single purchase transactions?
A single purchase transaction has one receipt or contract. Here are two examples of single purchase transactions. A single trip to a kitchen supply store to purchase cooking utensils, and a one-year contract for vended meals.
Courtney, in the two examples of single purchase transactions, which one of those would be a micropurchase? A single trip to a kitchen supply store with a receipt for $45, or a one-year vended meal contract totaling $45,000?
Since a micropurchase is a single purchase transaction equal to or less than $3,500, the receipt showing $45 would be considered a micropurchase. The one-year contract is over the micropurchase threshold of $3,500, so it would not be considered a micropurchase. We will discuss the small purchase method later in this webinar.
Can you give me some more examples of micropurchase?
Other examples include purchasing paper from an office supply store, purchasing new plastic cups, plates, or serving utensils. And if an agency's dishwasher breaks, they may decide to pay someone to repair it or purchase a new one. In these cases, the cost is likely to be below the threshold. These are all examples of micropurchases.
You didn't mention groceries as an example of a micropurchase. Why not? Would shopping for groceries fall under the micropurchase method if the receipt was less than $3,500?
Technically, yes. A trip to the grocery store would be a single purchase transaction. However, remember, we stated that agencies should make an analysis to determine the most economical approach for purchases. If you are going to make ongoing routine purchases that add up to a significant amount of money by the end of the year, agencies should consider whether there are alternative purchase methods to purchasing groceries that might make more sense. Here are some questions for you to consider. Can you get better prices by shopping around and choosing the store with the lowest overall prices? Can you obtain price quotes for a contract with a distributor for some of the food items you need? Let's talk more about the micropurchase method and then come back to this thought. So now that we know that a micropurchase is a single purchase transaction equal to or less than the micropurchase threshold, what else do agencies need to know?
First, they should know that price quotes are not required for micropurchases.
Correct, as long as two conditions are met.
What are the two conditions?
First, the agency's purchasing agent should consider the price they are paying to be reasonable. Remember, agencies should focus on making economical purchases.
What's the second condition of a micropurchase?
The regulations state, to the extent practicable, meaning reasonable, agencies must spread their micropurchases equitably among qualified suppliers.
Spread their micropurchases equitably among qualified suppliers? Does that mean they need to shop at different stores?
Yes. Let's say an agency always purchases paper from an office supply store down the street, even though there are other office supply stores in the area. The regulations require, if practicable, that agencies shop at different stores when following the micropurchase method. Rotating stores allows multiple vendors to benefit from federal dollars coming into their community. This is what is meant by distributing micropurchases equitably among qualified suppliers.
Agencies may be asked to provide a list of stores where micropurchases were made and document how much was spent during the program year at each of the stores. The example on the slide shows the agency shopped at 3 different office supply stores. Documentation of total expenditures at each store for the entire year showed that the agency spread their purchases equitably among qualified suppliers. If documentation showed that only $200 was spent at office supply store A and $2,000 was spent at office supply store B, the agency would not be compliant with the micropurchase method because purchases were not equitably spread among qualified suppliers.
So it isn't enough just to shop at different stores? Agencies must ensure they spend the same amount of money at each store during the program year?
Yes. This will be a big change for agencies that are used to shopping at only one store.
Some agencies have asked what they should do if they are located in a rural area and there is only one store within a reasonable distance.
That's a common question. The regulations state, to the extent practicable, spread purchases equitably among qualified suppliers. If there are no other qualified suppliers within a reasonable distance, then considering the cost of gas and increased labor hours, it would not be practicable to drive a long distance in order to spread purchases equitably among qualified suppliers. If your agency does determine that it's not practicable to shop at different stores, the reason that it's not practicable should be included in your written procedures for the micropurchase method. Please remember that your procurement procedures must be fair and reasonable. If another qualified supplier is just a few miles away, but you do not shop there, you will not be in compliance with the micropurchase method of procurement. Let's talk about shopping for groceries again. Many agencies tell us they prefer to shop at a specific store because it has the lowest prices. First, it's always preferable to shop at a store that has the lowest prices. However, because the micropurchase method requires that you consider prices to be reasonable and to spread your purchases equitably among qualified suppliers, You would no longer be following the micropurchase method if you shopped at only one store because of lower prices. This means even if your receipt is less than $3,500, it would not be considered a micropurchase because when prices are considered, you are following the small purchase method. Let's discuss the small purchase method now.
Part 2, the small purchase method. You now know that the micropurchase threshold is $3,500. Therefore, single purchase transactions equal to or less than $3,500 are considered a micropurchase unless you choose to follow the small purchase method. Agencies must follow the small purchase method when their single purchase transaction falls below the small purchase threshold. What is the dollar amount of the small purchase threshold, Lori?
The small purchase threshold depends on the type of agency making the purchase. There are three main small purchase thresholds: the federal threshold, the state threshold, and the local threshold. Agencies must identify which threshold pertains to their agency. Let's review each one separately. The federal threshold pertains to all agencies that do not have lower state or local thresholds. Typically, the federal threshold pertains to private, nonprofit, and for-profit agencies. As the date of this webinar, it is set at $150,000. To make sure the dollar amount has not changed, agencies can check the Federal Acquisition Regulation Part 2, which can be located on the acquisition.gov webpage at the web address listed on this slide.
Does this mean if I'm a nonprofit agency and I have a vending contract valued at or below $150,000, I can follow the small purchase method?
Yes. If a private nonprofit agency has a contract for over $150,000, they must follow the formal purchase method. We recommend they watch the Formal Purchase Methods Webinar in addition to this webinar. School districts and county offices of education must comply with the CDE small purchase threshold. This threshold changes each calendar year based upon inflation. In January 2017, it was set at $88,300. After January 1st, 2018, agencies that must adhere to the CDE small purchase threshold should check the web link on this slide for the current threshold. Some agencies must comply with local small purchase thresholds that are set by either local governments or by their own agency. Agencies must always use the most restrictive applicable small purchase threshold.
Now that we know when agencies are required to follow the small purchase method, what are the requirements?
First, agencies are required to develop specifications for the goods or services they need. Second, they are required to contact an adequate number of qualified sources to obtain price quotes.
How many quotes are required?
The regulations state that price or rate quotes must be obtained from an adequate number of qualified sources. The NSD interprets this to mean that in areas with an abundant number of qualified sources, an agency would get more quotes than in an area with only 2 qualified sources. The agency should consider the number of qualified sources when determining the number of quotes to obtain.
How are price quotes to be obtained?
The NSD recommends that agencies obtain quotes in writing from vendors. This reduces the chance of a dispute or the potential for an agency to participate in unethical behavior. It is allowable to contact vendors by phone. However, documentation received over the phone must be written down and maintained.
What if an agency can only find one qualified source?
The regulations allow what's referred to as non-competitive procurement under 4 criteria. The 4 criteria are, number 1, after solicitation, competition is deemed inadequate. This means an agency has done a proper job soliciting for goods or services and they only received 1 quote. The second criteria is the goods or services are only available from one source. The third criteria is there is an urgent or public need that will not permit a delay. And the fourth criteria is the state agency approves after written request. Agencies are strongly encouraged to contact their program specialists if they have a non-competitive or sole source situation. Failure to adequately follow procurement guidelines and requirements related to sole source or non-competitive procurement may result in financial findings against an agency.
What else are agencies required to do when following the small purchase method?
Agencies must ensure that the specifications they provide to prospective vendors are the same. This ensures they are comparing apples to apples and are conducting business in a fair and equitable manner. They should choose the vendor with the lowest price and keep all procurement records as documentation for administrative reviews or ARs. School districts must comply with the State of California Public Contract Code, Section 20116, which requires them to annually publish a notice inviting contractors to register to be notified of future informal bidding projects. Whenever the school district seeks a contractor or vendor for a small purchase, they must notify the contractors or vendors who are registered. This requirement pertains only to school districts.
Do you have any tips for agencies that use the small purchase method for obtaining vended meals?
Yes, they must be sure to provide sufficient detail in their specifications to ensure they are requesting meals that meet the specific child nutrition program meal pattern. It's a good idea to request a variety of fresh fruits and vegetables and whole grains. They should also document the other required terms and conditions of the contract. If desired, agencies could also require that the vendors provide a sample of their menu items for the children to taste.
How would a taste test be included in a competitive solicitation where the vendor with the lowest price must be selected?
Agencies could require that the vendors they contact who are interested in submitting a quote provide a sample of their meals for the children to taste. The agency could set a threshold, for example, if less than 85% of the children do not find the food acceptable, then the vendor would not be considered responsible, which means capable of meeting the terms and conditions of the contract. The agency could then request quotes only from the vendors who passed the taste test.
This will help to ensure that agencies are getting meals that the children like to eat. If an agency does include a taste test as part of their solicitation, they should be sure all vendors contacted are given the same detailed information as to how the taste test will be conducted, how it will be evaluated, when and where to bring the specific items, and a contact name and phone number. Lori, what is meant by awarding contracts to responsive and responsible vendors?
Agencies must award contracts to responsive and responsible vendors. Responsive means that the vendor is willing to meet all the terms and conditions specified in the solicitation. A responsible vendor means that the vendor is capable of meeting the terms and conditions in the solicitation. Using the example of the taste test, if the vendor fails to achieve the threshold the agency has set for passing the taste test, they would not be considered a responsible vendor. In this case, their price quote would not be considered.
What are other ways to assess whether a vendor is responsible?
Agencies should consider asking a vendor to provide references from other agencies of similar size to assess whether they are responsible. It's up to each agency to determine how to assess whether vendors are responsible. An agency should also consider whether the vendor has the financial and technical resources to meet your needs.
Once a vendor is selected, can the vendor develop a contract for the agency to sign?
No, contractors may not develop their own contracts when participating in either the CACSP or the SFSP. Agencies must use the CDE Standard Food Service Vending Agreement found in the Download Form section of the Child Nutrition Information and Payment System, better known as CNIP. A copy of the contract shall be submitted to the CDE prior to beginning program operations under the contract. If an agency chooses to add additional provisions to the Standard Food Service Vending Agreement, it must be approved by the CDE. Public agencies may, with CDE approval, use their customary form of contract if it incorporates program provisions.
Can you give an example of how an agency could follow the small purchase method when buying groceries at a store?
Yes, here's one way an agency could compare prices and choose the store with the lowest prices. First, they would identify specific quantities of the top 10 items they purchase. They should be specific in order to compare apples to apples. The next step would be to obtain documentation of prices from different stores in the area. After adding up the prices for all items in a specific quantity, they should be able to determine which store has the lowest prices overall.
What if an agency doesn't have storage space for the large quantities of food that are available from a wholesale store?
Then it may not be practicable to shop there. Sometimes agencies purchase specific foods from a wholesale store and other foods needed in smaller quantities from a retail grocery store. In this case, they should justify which retail grocery store has the lowest prices. Remember, documentation is required.
How would they obtain documentation for prices?
Agencies can look for prices online, get quotes over the phone, or physically go to the store. If they obtain quotes over the phone, they must write the prices down. If they physically go to the store, they should take a picture of the prices. This documentation must be retained to show evidence of obtaining price quotes and selecting the vendor with the lowest price. If they obtain prices online, they should print and retain the prices as proof of cost.
How often would they need to obtain quotes?
The federal regulations do not define the frequency for conducting this type of analysis. A best practice is to obtain quotes annually. Agencies might also consider developing specifications and obtaining price quotes from food distributors. It may be cost-effective to establish a contract with a distributor who delivers food. This will depend on the size of your agency.
Is the small purchase method required for purchasing groceries?
Technically, no. A single purchase transaction that is equal to or less than $3,500 could be considered a micropurchase. However, as mentioned before, consideration should be given to the most economical approach. Whenever there are routine, ongoing purchases, the small purchase method will likely result in lower expenditures. It is up to each agency to justify why the micropurchase method is the best approach for the items purchased using this method.
Lori, is there anything agencies should know about purchasing equipment?
Yes. First, let's define what equipment is. Equipment is any item of non-expendable personal property with a useful life of more than 1 year and a per-unit acquisition cost of $5,000 or more. Non-expendable personal property can be tangible, having physical existence, such as equipment, or intangible, having no physical existence, such as a patent, inventions, and copyrights.
Would a refrigerator that costs $2,500 be considered equipment?
No. All items less than $5,000 are considered supplies and should be included under the line item for supplies in the program budget. The total dollar amount for supplies is approved by your program analyst prior to starting your program year.
How is approval for equipment different than supplies?
In order to purchase equipment, agencies must contact their program specialist and obtain approval in writing for this specific purchase before making the purchase. If they do not obtain prior written approval, they could receive fiscal findings during an administrative review.
What if the agency is participating in one of the school nutrition programs?
I'm glad you brought that up. School nutrition program operators do not need to obtain specific prior written approval if the equipment is listed on the U.S. Department of Agriculture Capital Expenditure Approved List. This list is available on the CDE School Nutrition Program Cafeteria Funds Guidance webpage at the link on this slide.
So a school that is operating either the CACFP at-risk after-school supper program or the SFSP would not need specific prior written approval to purchase equipment over $5,000 if the item was on the USDA Capital Expenditure Approved List, but a Boys and Girls Club operating the CACFP at-risk after-school supper program or the SFSP would need to obtain specific prior written approval because they are not a school nutrition program operator.
Yes, you've got it.
It's time for a quiz. An agency needs to purchase 3 new gas ranges for 3 kitchen sites, and the cost for each one is about $2,000. How should they make this purchase? Should they, A, make a micropurchase by purchasing each gas range separately so their invoices are below the micropurchase threshold? Or B, follow the small purchase method and develop specifications, obtain price quotes, and choose the vendor with the lowest price item.
In this situation, the cost of 3 gas ranges is about $6,000, which is over the micropurchase threshold. Agencies cannot arbitrarily separate their purchases so they can fall below the micropurchase threshold to avoid getting price quotes. Therefore, the agency would need to follow the small purchase method. This concludes the Informal Purchase Methods for Community Nutrition Programs webinar. For additional procurement information, visit the CDE Procurement and the Child Nutrition Programs webpage at the link on this slide. There are also additional procurement webinars for community nutrition programs on the Procurement Trainings for Community Nutrition Programs webpage at the link on this slide.
If you have questions after reviewing the NSD Procurement webpage and the webinars, please contact your program specialist. To find your CACSP specialist, type in the link listed on this slide. To contact an SFSP specialist, call the NSD at either of the phone numbers or email addresses shown on this slide. Specialists are here to assist agencies with ensuring they are meeting the federal procurement standards.
You can print a certificate of completion for this webinar by accessing the link on your slide. If you have difficulty printing your certificate, please contact your program specialist. Keep this certificate on file as you may be asked to show it during an administrative review. Thank you for listening in today.